Hello, everyone. Good evening. For our audience in other parts of the world, good morning or good afternoon. In fact, our three panelists will talk with us from three different parts of the world. Welcome you to the Asian American Scholar Forum webinar in May. My name is Jodong Zhang, a member of the forum. I'm also a professor of computer science and engineering at The Ohio State University. I'd like to say a few words about our organization, the AASF. This organization was established in January 2021, and this young organization is nonprofit and non-political, representing a community of Asian American scholars. AASF has more than a dozen of Asian American professional organization members in different areas, representing more than 7,000 Asian American scholars. Our mission is to promote academic belonging, openness, and equality for all. Today's webinar is about higher education system in China, which is the largest in the world, with more than 3,000 universities and colleges serving more than 40 million students on campus. Since 1998, several plans in China have been launched to develop a small group of elite institutions into world-class universities. We are very fortunate to have invited three prominent American scholars and leaders who have been involved in the development efforts. And they will give us their perspectives today and on the rise of Chinese university towards the world class. I'd like to introduce the moderator of the webinar. Professor Yasheng Huang is APEC Professor of International Management and a Professor of Global Economics and Management at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's the faculty director of action learning at MIT Sloan School of Management. He was also associate dean in the Sloan School between 2013 to 2017. Yasheng was on faculty at the University of Michigan and Harvard Business School before MIT. Yasheng, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Xiaodong. This is our monthly webinar, and we are going to discuss an extremely important topic, the rise of Chinese universities. And we have three excellent speakers, and they are not only distinguished academics, but they have had long histories of engagement with Chinese universities. Let me introduce them very briefly, and then invite them to give their remarks. We begin with Professor Juan Hopcroft. He is IBM Professor of Engineering and Applied Mathematics in Computer Science, Cornell University. And he is also a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And then we have Professor Jeffrey Lehman, who is the inaugural Vice Chancellor of NYU Shanghai. NYU has a campus in Shanghai. So this is a very interesting engagement between China and the United States. And then we have Professor J.S. Siegel, who is the Provost of Fulbright University, Vietnam, and Chair of the International Advisory Board, SPST, Tianjin University. Okay, let me invite our three distinguished speakers to give their perspectives, their views on the rise of Chinese universities and the current landscape of Chinese higher education as compared with the time when they began engagements with China. And I'm going to call on the speakers according to this the sequence that we advertised. Juan, can I invite you to begin the session?
Oh,
Juan, you are muted.
There, I think. Can you hear me now? Yeah, good. I've been teaching at Cornell University for 55 years. And during that time, I've spent a significant effort trying to help other countries improve their educational systems. And I've spent 15 years in China, working in China, but primarily limited to computer science. And I worked with the top 40 universities. So it's kind of a small view of the whole picture. And what I thought I would do is start with telling you the difference between university education in the United States and education in China. One of the things is the US has had a stable educational system for over 100 years. And it's a stable system, it exists, and that's different than China. China has only had a stable government for about 50 years. And maybe 40 years ago, parents realized that their child had to get a university education to get a good job. And what happened is the number of students going to university increased at a rate of about 1 million per year. And China had to produce a sufficient number of universities to meet this demand. And so they built approximately 50 universities a year for 20 years. And now I'm going to say they have 1,500 universities. But I noticed that depending on who you ask how many universities there are, you get radically different answers. And the reason for that, I think, is we have different definitions of what a university is. To be a university, in my count, there has to be at least 2 colleges with a number of departments. But in China, actually, when I talked to the Minister of Education, he told me there were 6,000 universities. But many of these are just a single subject, like University of Space Science. And I don't want to count that as a university because it's not the kind of university that I'm accustomed to. The other thing, I'd like to talk about the mission of a US university versus the mission of a Chinese university, because the missions are fundamentally different. China has produced enough scientists and engineers so that if the government needs some science done, they'll simply hire the appropriate people in a government lab and get it done in a timely fashion. The same if a company needs something done, they will hire the existing talent. So a US university, the mission is to produce the next generation of talent. It's not to do research. Although you might wonder about that, but the real mission of the university is to educate people for a good life. In China, China has not yet produced enough scientists and engineers to meet the needs of the country. So the university in China has 2 missions. One of those missions is to produce the next generation of talent, the same as the US. But they also have a mission to help the government and companies with different science projects. Now, this creates a problem if you let this mission to do science interfere with the mission to produce the next generation of talent. If you do that, you'll never solve this problem of not having enough scientists and engineers. And one of the difficulties with the university education in China, although it's being fixed very quickly, is university presidents are trying to raise their international ranking. And the international ranking is based primarily on the amount of research money and the number of papers published. And so this really encourages faculty to get involved in applied research with companies and bring in money and so forth. But the top universities are changing that now. I run centers in 3 of the top universities. I'll just mention the one at Shanghai Jiaotong University. I initially chaired the hiring committee for computer science department, and I was hiring a few good people, but I noticed that they would quit after 2 years. And so I interviewed them, and what they told me, they said there was so much pressure to raise research money or to publish papers, we simply aren't interested. So I went to the president and told him that it did not make sense for me to recruit for him unless he changed the environment. And his response was, he said, John, I can't change the environment for the entire university, but I will give you the environment for the faculty that you hire. So we set up a center, and I tell the people that I now hire, don't worry about getting research funds and don't worry about publishing papers. Focus on just 2 things. One, excellence in teaching is going to be necessary. And then secondly, your professional reputation as viewed by international scholars. And I've hired 25 faculty there. And I'm in each of the 3 centers, I'm trying to hire 5 additional faculty per year. I think that one of the fundamental differences is that China is just building a quality educational system, and they're going to have it done fairly quickly. I'd just like to mention one program. The Minister of Education has started a project. It's called Project 101. And he's asked the president of PKU to run the project. And it's to improve the quality of computer science education at the top 33 universities in China and bring them up to world standards. And it has 2 components. One of them is what is the content of the courses that should be taught, and the other is excellence in teaching. Now, the way it works, since the top 33 universities get their budget from the Ministry of Education, they just have to do what they're told, and each university is assigned a key person. And on the content, they were asked for the 33 of them to develop what the top 10 courses were in computer science. And then each course was assigned to one university, and the person at that university was asked to find the top 10 faculty in China in that subject and produce the content. The other part is probably more important, and that is to improve the quality of instruction. And if I could just give a short story, it'll illustrate it. I was sitting in on a course. The course was in Mandarin. I don't know what the content was. There was a young faculty member. She was very good. And when she started, there were 30 students in the course. And when she started her lecture, every student was engaged. But then at some point, half of them disengaged. And I had looked up on the board and I realized she had written a mathematical theorem on the board. And I think what happened is the students didn't really understand why that theorem was important and so forth. But after the course, I talked to her and I told her how student interest changed with various things that she was talking about. And what we agreed that it maybe would have been better if she had said intuitively what the theorem meant, and then engaged the students in writing down a mathematical statement if she wanted to prove it. But we then talked about what should the students remember a month later about the lecture. And it probably was not the proof of the theorem. Maybe she should have, she spent 20 minutes proving it. Maybe what she should have done is said, if you want to prove this theorem, here are the key things you need to do it. But what the Ministry of Education is going to do is have someone sit in and assess the student reaction, and then talk to the faculty member afterwards as to what they might do to do better. So I think that China very quickly is going to bring its top universities up to the level of the top universities in the US. In fact, they have an advantage because students want to go to the top universities. And in the US, students tend to spread out to a fair number of universities. In China, they all want to go to Tsinghua or Shanghai Jiaotong or one of maybe 10 universities. So I measured the quality of the incoming freshman class at Shanghai Jiaotong University and compared it to Cornell. And the top student in both universities was essentially the same. But at Cornell, there were 3 or 4, and then the quality started dropping off. In China, there were maybe 50 before the quality dropped off. So I think things are going to change very quickly. That's basically, I think, what I have to tell you about the differences between the two educational systems.
Thank you, John. That's a fascinating account. I have some follow-up questions, but I'll postpone them later. Jeff?
Let me unmute there. Thank you, Yasheng. Good to see you, John and Jay. So my story with China, I guess, starts in 1998 when I was still the dean of the University of Michigan Law School. In that year, after coming to China, we started partnerships with the law schools at Beida and Tsinghua. Then when I was president at Cornell, we built partnerships with Beida and Tsinghua and the China Agricultural University and the China Academy of Sciences. And then in 2008, at the behest of my friend Xu Jihong, who was then the president of Beida, I came to China, I moved to China to help him to create a true American-style law school on Beida's experimental campus in Shenzhen. So I was there in Shenzhen until 2012, when I moved up to Shanghai to help my friend John Sexton, the then president of NYU, who wanted to create a true Sino-American joint research university that would also be a full degree granting campus of NYU. So in 1998, when I was first working with Chinese universities, the country was really in the phase that John was describing, where it was dramatically increasing total educational capacity. Back in 1992, only 4% of high school graduates were going to college. And so that had to change quickly. New universities were springing up all the time. Existing universities were being asked to double the number of students that they taught in just a couple of years. But at the same time, there was a continuing interest in elite education. Xiaodong mentioned 1998, which is when Project 985 was begun, and then there was the C9 League, and now it's double first-class universities. All of these are efforts by the national government to strengthen the top 40 universities or so. So I guess I would frame strengths and weaknesses similarly to the way John does, but with slight differences. I would say that I agree with John that everywhere in the world, top universities are expected to produce graduates who can lead lives of satisfaction and contribution. But I would also say that top universities are also in part dedicated to producing research that meaningfully changes how we understand the world. Now that's can include some applied research, but as John notes, in most countries, a lot of the R&D work is done in the private sector or in government rather than in universities. But I do believe in the ideal of the research university, where research and teaching are integrated in the lives of both faculty and students. Now to produce both great research and teaching, all universities rely on four inputs. There's student talent, there's faculty talent, there's material resources, and then there's what you might think of as the technology of the university, the culture of curiosity and inquiry and academic freedom and engagement with the global research community and peer review, those elements. And I think when you talk about the strength of China's top universities, I would agree with John that among the four inputs, the student talent is extraordinary. It is really amazing. I would say that in the early years of my time in China, working with Chinese universities, the biggest weakness was actually a dearth of material resources. The universities just didn't have the money that you need to recruit top faculty and enable them to do their work without having to work extra jobs on the side in order to pay the bills. Chinese faculty salaries were very, very low. Now things have definitely gotten better, especially with the various talent programs, not just Thousand Talents, but it's still the case here. I think that graduate student stipends and postdoc stipends are still far below the global market level. I guess if I were to pick one reason why, in my view, elite education has improved over the past quarter century in China, I would point to the country's willingness to experiment in a decentralized way. The Ministry of Education does set policy at a high level, but during the period of the most dramatic improvements in elite higher education, you saw provinces and cities and individual institutions like Shanghai Jiao Tong University being given latitude to decide how they would implement those policies. So one form of experiment, the one I know best, is the Sino Foreign Joint University Program. So that program launched almost 20 years ago with the University of Ningbo Nottingham, followed shortly thereafter by Hong Kong Baptist University and Xi'an Jiao Tong Liverpool. Today, there are 9 such university programs, and they couldn't be more different one from the other. Each one has its own mission and structure and culture. So Shanghai, where I am, is home to lots of serious universities, Jiaoda and Fudan and East China Normal University and Tongji and others. But Shanghai wanted NYU Shanghai to be different. Shanghai wanted this school to be a comprehensive research university at the level of international peers. And it also wanted our school to experiment with an undergraduate pedagogy that would nurture student creativity and prepare them to be effective members and leaders of multicultural teams after they graduate. So we are of the 9, we're the only Sino-foreign joint university that draws half its students from overseas. So every student in the dormitory in the first year has a roommate from a country that's other than their own country. Our classes are all taught in English. Students have to speak actively in class. Every student has to spend at least one semester overseas. Most are gone for a full year. And the culture that we work hard to sustain is one of respectful questioning and disagreement within a community of campus academic freedom. We have distribution requirements, so everybody has to take courses in global intellectual history, the humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, algorithmic thinking. And although it's not required, almost all of our students, whatever their major, also take fine arts classes in music or art or dance, even if they didn't have any experience with those fields before coming to college. So that's my experience. That's what I've observed. Why don't I stop there, Yashil?
Thank you, Jeff. Let me ask Jay to share with us his perspective.
Thank you, Yusheng. So first, let me correct a mistake on my part, which is that I'm the former provost of Fulbright University. So lest they think I'm trying to steal their luster. But, and more important to tonight's discussion, it has to do with my involvement in China, which began much later than John or Jeff. It began in around 2011, where I was more or less recruited as a consultant for the then president of Tianjin University, Li Jiajun. And his concern was how to develop an international American or Western style program inside the belly of the beast, if you will, inside a national Chinese university. And so we talked for a while about it, and then finally he just said, why don't you come and run the program? So I came as the first non-Chinese science dean, ran the School of Pharmacy and the School of Life Science, which we eventually turned into what's called the Health Science Platform, which in America would be something like the pre-med program or the preclinical health science program. And we developed everything from soup to nuts, that is teaching, research, so bachelor's, master's, PhD. We built a building, we hired about 80 faculty, and the whole program was done in English. Well, in order to do that, of course, we needed talent who could produce in that environment. And so we took advantage of the 1,000 Talent program, which may be of interest to people. I think in the end, we had somewhere between 10 and 12,000 talent hires in Tianjin. And from those 1,000 Talent program, we had 3 national Chinese Friendship Award winners and 7 local Tianjin Friendship Award winners. And so we were a relatively high profile program working together with the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Science and Technology, as well as with what was then called the State Authority on Foreign Experts Association. So I think they were the ones who first really kicked off a lot of the 1,000 Talent program. Funding, of course, became a very important issue. And so we pitched to what was called SAFIA and MOST at the time, a program that ended up being called the NICE program, which is supposed to be the National International Centers of Excellence. And this program, which we kicked off, gave us funding to help support the salary of these faculty that we were recruiting. And it eventually became the model for 16 programs throughout China. So there are now 16 of these NICE programs. And every one of them needs to have a kind of international center of excellence component. And so very much as Jeff just said, this ended up being widely distributed, but also widely heterogeneous. Our program was definitely a soup to nuts, really focused on recruiting non-native Chinese, developing everything in English, but there are also programs that are very monolithic that only deal with one particular subject in this area. Having such a broad remit, we came up a lot into the question of research. And I think this is, of course, something that's been done very well in China, but it's also been a problem for bringing in international talent. The Chinese grant system is still primarily run in Chinese. It's almost impossible to get on the board to being an advisor or being a reviewer in the grants system if you're not Chinese. And so in a very, very unusual event, I was actually the head of what's called a 973 grant. These are sort of like international centers in which you need a consortium. We had 30 PIs from 12 different universities. And this was the first time, again, that an international person was allowed to run such a grant because of the importance of these grants, because of the coordination over many universities. Okay, the point of all that is, I think I have a little bit of perspective over the research and the teaching landscape. I must also say that even as dean, I taught organic chemistry and I taught ethics, and I taught a course in laboratory safety every year while I was there. So I had some feeling also for how the students were working. Now, the one thing that struck me about China is that, I mean, absolutely, it's growing at a phenomenal rate. There are fantastic things going on, but there is something of a bijou effect. By that, let me just say, we heard that there are somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 institutions that you might call universities in China. But if you ask which of those come out to being excellent, I would say it's about 1%. If you ask yourself about the United States, there are also about 3,000 universities, plus or minus 1,000. But if you ask yourself about the level of excellence, you might say, well, there's probably 10%. And then in this place that I've been also a long period of my life, a decade at the University of Zurich, if I ask a tiny little country like Switzerland that doesn't even qualify to be a community in Tianjin, right? 5 or 6, let's say 7 million people, as opposed to the 15 to 20 million in a town of like Tianjin. Over 50% of the institutions in Switzerland would qualify. If you consider in this small country, you've got EPFL, ETH, University of Basel, Zurich, Geneva, etc. And so this distribution of talent, this concept that if the government needs something or if a business needs something, can they put out a sign and tomorrow get applications from 10 qualified engineers or scientists or historians or whatever else that they need? This is not purely a STEM issue. In Switzerland, it's trivial. And in fact, many CEOs have told me they're happy to pay the higher salaries in Switzerland because it's so easy to get talent. They can get to the market a year ahead of the competition. Whereas if we go then quickly to China, what you find in the Chinese environment is that, yes, you can hang out a sign and you can get 100 applicants, but these applicants will often only stay for 6 months to a year. Many of them show up and they don't really have the qualifications that you were anticipating. There's a much greater heterogeneity because the number of PhDs that are coming out is large, but the quality is reflected again in this 1% versus 50%. We can choose our favorite number. And so this plays an important role in how China can actually distribute this talent. So growing and building universities is relatively easy because there are lots of great manufacturing companies and great construction companies, but populating those with faculty who can in fact speak an international language that will become a language that allows you to influence education globally. Those that could actually command all of the teaching pedagogy that we would like to see, or those that could actually conduct meaningful research that is not simply doing product development or some very late stage. These are all really serious issues that have to be brought forward. And it is a general endemic problem for China coming up in the future. Let me point out something that I thought was very modest that Liu Keqiang said. He warned in a speech we were sitting in once. He said, you know, everyone likes to talk about raising these 1 billion people out of poverty. But remember, we're talking about poverty plus 1 yuan, right? We're not talking about raising these people into a middle class. And of course, the numbers that are being defined are of course, relatively small numbers. Jeff and I discussed once that poverty is sometimes half the median, which in Switzerland is about 40,000 Swiss francs a year. And in China, a really well-paid engineer will get about 20,000 Swiss francs a year. And people say, oh, well, the cost of living is, trust me, is incomparable. The lifestyle of someone who is considered to be outside poverty in China versus someone who is below the poverty line in Switzerland, I think the Chinese would all move to Switzerland in order to have that. And so I think we need to keep that in mind, that there are fantastic strides. I don't want to discount from any of those strides, but that it is a qualitatively different thing when we talk about excellence in those different type of areas. And the same thing is going to be true for the quote quality of the research and the quality of the students who are coming out when we project that broadly over China. Okay, I mean, I'll wrap that up for the moment. I'm sure there'll be follow-on questions, but I think it gives you some perspective of who I am and a little bit about the areas I might be able to address.
Thank you so much, Jay. We already have a number of questions coming in the chat, but first let me ask some questions to have some conversation among four of us first. This is related to the point that Jeff made about kind of thinking about universities producing two kinds of human capital, right? So the general human capital for the society, for the government, for companies, for schools, for newspapers, for media. And the other is kind of a research human capital, the researchers. My impression, and this is based on, not on data, but it's just impressionistic evidence. My impression is that many Chinese universities don't hire domestic PhD graduates, right? So even from the best universities in China, such as Tsinghua or Peking University, that may not be true now, or it may not be true in the fields that you work in. But if that is true, then it does imply that Chinese universities are, they have very good faculty now, but many of them received education, PhD degrees outside of China. But they themselves are not educating the next generation of researchers. And that may be changing. So again, I'm saying this without really studying the issue. So let me ask maybe Juan and then Jeff and then Jay to give you impressions on that particular question.
You're on mute, John. Oops.
I think the problem with PhD programs in China is the talent that comes to the program is not good enough. And until they improve the undergraduate programs, so that and while there are some very high quality programs at the top universities, the best undergraduates who want a PhD go abroad to get the PhD. So the students coming into Chinese PhD programs are not very well educated. And I think in 3 or 4 years, once the undergraduate programs are world-class at a sufficient number of universities, the PhD programs will become much better. And then universities will start hiring faculty from Chinese PhD programs.
I might just add a little bit. I think, you know, in the US, the norm is in fact that you do not hire your own PhD graduates as your entry-level faculty. It's important for young scholars to be circulating and to get to know the larger international peer community of scholars and researchers. So I'm not surprised, I guess, that the best universities in China are hiring students who did their PhDs elsewhere. Often they're hiring students who grew up in China, then did their PhD elsewhere, and then come back because they're plugged in to the international research community in a way that traditionally has been hard to do if you're doing your PhD inside China. Now, as they build a stronger faculty community of people who spent a lot of time and are well connected to the larger international research community, those faculty members then become attractive places for students here to want to study. They say, I want to go study with this professor at Beida, and that professor can then mentor them and get them plugged in. But I do think what is most important is that the universities continue to make progress in benchmarking themselves with the global research community. And I think that is really one of the most important challenges. It's not just a matter of publication counts or impact factors or things like that. You really want your faculty to be properly connected with their peers, and you want to be working around standards of international peer review.
Yeah, Jeff, let me just be very clear. I wasn't talking about hiring your own students, right? So I'm talking about one Chinese university sometimes refusing to hire PhD graduates from another Chinese university. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what you don't find in the United States.
Correct. Got it.
Yeah, we don't hire our own students, but we hire students from NYU, from other universities. Jay?
And so I think the landscape is changing here, even compared to 2010 when I started. I think that was very much true. And there's no question that the rise of Chinese universities has been developed by the West, right? If you look at the people who have come back, who run the programs, whether it's Shi Yigong or Chen Shiyi or Rao Zihe, all of these people were trained in the United States or in Europe, and in fact then brought back that tradition. The biggest problem they've had when you talk to them is that when they come back to China, the Chinese society, which is very much a conformist society, puts enormous pressures on them to behave as part of the system that Jeff was just talking about, to re-plug in, to re-network, to re-harmonize with the system. And that reharmonizing with the system, of course, steals from them the kinds of academic freedom that they were used to in the West, the kinds of craziness, so they can make great advances. I think if you take students who are only trained in China, what you would find is that those students could never really push things forward because their whole training had been oriented towards conformity. Their whole training it's not because of intellect, and it's not because the courses weren't good enough, and it's not because these people, couldn't be creative. It's that the system inherently favors harmonization and networking over the independent. But that's changed a lot for political reasons as well as for scientific reasons. The quality of the students and the education has gone up at these greater universities. The academic freedom in the area of science and technology, which couple very well to the government's interests, those have become looser in some ways. And so certainly getting a PhD at Beida and doing a postdoc at MIT could bring you back to a really great position, which wouldn't be so different than doing a PhD at the University of Zurich and doing a postdoc at MIT. Also in a place like Switzerland, I'll keep bringing that as my reference point, sends its people out to another country to bring them back to have a good perspective. The real issue on the horizon is what will happen politically. And will academic freedom continue to develop? Will there still be the ability that when you go abroad, and those freedoms, those intellectual freedoms that you have, will it still be possible to draw people back into the Chinese environment if the Chinese environment becomes more and more restrictive? Because once you know the freedom, having it taken away from you is even more painful.
Thank you, Jay. Juan, you have your hand.
One of the things that in the US, the reason the universities are so good is they seek the best PhD candidates they can get from around the entire world. But China is not able to do this because of a language problem. If in the US you invite someone from China to be in your PhD program, that person probably speaks English or at least is fluent enough. But if someone from the US was attracted to a Chinese PhD program, they'd be in a difficulty because they wouldn't speak Mandarin. So this language problem is going to be a serious problem.
Okay, so let me raise another big issue, and then I will take questions from the audience. Another landscape has changed, which is the relationship between China and the United States, compared with 10 years ago, compared with even 5 years ago, right? Asian American Scholar Forum was founded in the aftermath of the arrest of Professor Gang Chen. And specifically, he was arrested for representing MIT to pursue a collaborative project with SASTEC, right? So the political landscape has changed. Political landscape within China has changed. Political landscape between China and the US has changed. Let me ask our speakers to address this issue, right? How, in light of this new reality, do you think there are ways for American universities to, or Western universities in general, to collaborate with Chinese universities in a way that is still beneficial to both sides, and in a way that doesn't violate academic freedom and values on democracy, on rights, and and national security issues? So if you could talk about what are those ways, and Jeff, especially you operate a campus in China, so we would be very interested in hearing from you your perspective on how this larger environment has impacted your operation in Shanghai. Let me start with Jeff, and then go to Jay and Juan.
Yeah, thank you, Yasheng. A great question, and you know, I think when NYU Shanghai began, I think I assumed, and most of us assumed, that there would be a wave. And Duke Kunshan started up the following year, and I got phone calls every year from lots of schools, lots of top schools in the US that were considering doing similar kinds of joint ventures in China. And really since, let's say January 2017, to pick an arbitrary time, the phone stopped ringing. And I think, you know, especially once the China initiative got going, and I feel honored in some ways to see Professor Chen on the screen there. I think it really poisoned the well in terms of what American universities feel capable of doing. I think it'd be very hard to persuade a board of trustees today that it would be a good idea. And I think, you know, it's still the case, given the approach that's taken even in the post-China initiative days, to research collaborations. It's just become extremely challenging. I think in terms of making this kind of partnership work, I think both John and Jay talked about how heterogeneous China is, how heterogeneous higher education is in China, and what has enabled NYU Shanghai to prosper throughout this time has been the quality of the partnership. We have had the great, just great partners in Washada, East China Normal University, the district of Pudong, and the city of Shanghai. I do think in order for this kind of a relationship to work, it's necessary to be very, very clear up front about what each side wants from the relationship. So in the early discussions with NYU Shanghai, the leadership of NYU and the leadership of ECNU were very clear with each other about what they hoped to gain. Unlike some universities, NYU had no interest in expanding its pool of potential students. It was in the process of shifting its identity from being a great national research university to being a transnational research university that enables its students and faculty to circulate easily among the world's great cities. And so what mattered most to NYU was the maintenance of a common intellectual culture throughout the network. Things like intellectual curiosity, academic freedom, radical openness to people who have different worldviews, active learning by the students, challenging the conventional wisdom. This is the tradition that dates back to Bologna, that sees universities as temples of cosmopolitan exploration, is the phrase I like to use. So NYU was very clear with its partners at ECNU and Pudong and Shanghai, and the relationship has worked because those three partners have enthusiastically shared that vision. I think that kind of conversation has to happen at the launch of a university in order for it to succeed. I think we're in a pause right now. I think we're in a moment where there is this deeply unfortunate mutual distrust throughout the society, and that makes it risky for university leaders and university boards to take this kind of a risk. I hope that it's just a pause and that tempers will cool and we will get back to a healthier mode of interaction. But it is unfortunate right now that everything you read about China in the US is negative, and everything you read about the US and China is negative. And that doesn't help the emergence. It doesn't help our community. It doesn't help the international research community, the international academic community at all.
Thank you, Jeff. Jay?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important point. And certainly when I started in Tianjin University, I had to deal with that because I needed to hire 80 to 100 faculty and create these type of interactions. And so the first thing I did, or one of the very first things I did, was I set up a world tour for the president of Tianjin University. And we went to somewhere between 12 and 15 universities, not just in the US, and allowed him to meet the higher administrators to talk about what we wanted to do to create a sense of common ground. And what that allowed us to do then was to talk openly. I went, when we recruited J. Fraser Stoddart, who was then Nobel Prize winner in chemistry later, but before he had won the Nobel Prize, we recruited him as a 3-month 1,000 talent. We went directly to Northwestern. We talked directly with the provost. We have a letter of agreement that understands what each side wants. I did the same thing at Princeton, at UCLA, at various other places. And in fact, anyone we recruited, the faculty we recruited out of South Florida or Vanderbilt or University of Bochum, Every one of them, we talked to their existing deans and said, look, we would like them to retain an adjunct professorship. We would like to keep the bridge alive. I'm not stealing your faculty. I want to create an elasticity. And here's what we're looking for. Here's what we plan to do. That transparency was very helpful when these different issues began to occur in the last few years. I know because the provost of Northwestern told Fraser Stoddart that they were visited by the US authorities. And of course, it was very helpful to them. They could just pull out the paperwork and say, look, this is what we negotiated. There's nothing nefarious here. And so part of it is having that up front. In addition, I worked very closely with the US Embassy in Beijing. So I met with their science analysts. I served on panels for them. I openly explained to them what was going on in our university situation. And so during my tenure there was never, even though Tianjin is on this list, right? I learned later that Tianjin is on some watch list for the US. Our institute was never questioned because we had done such a good job of laying everything out for people. The greater worry, though, for me, is that this kind of open communication will become less and less possible in the future. And it will be partly because of the political climate, but also the ramifications of social media control and other things. So if TikTok is not going to be a cross-border, if Netscape or if Safari and Google can't operate in China, then we'll have two parallel worlds of communication. And it'll be even harder if we don't have a channel by which we can communicate with one another. And so to me, it's the political issue, which I think, as Jeff said, is a temporary one. I think eventually mutual self-interest will lead both countries to realizing that they have to work together. They have to find these bridges. But if they've gone to trouble to make the trains run on two different scale of track, then rescaling those tracks is going to be a bigger problem than overcoming the social problem. Sorry.
Thank you, Jay. John.
Yeah, well, I hope that this political issue will just be temporary, and maybe in 5 years or so, things will come back. But right now, it's very hard for a US university to enter into a formal agreement with a Chinese university. They're very nervous about doing it. But that doesn't prevent researchers doing basic research to interacting with one another, because that doesn't require any exchange of money or doesn't require signing any kind of an agreement. They're simply both interested in the same problem and they share their views on it. And so it could be that a large amount of communication may take place between scientists in various countries, just informally. But when I do talk to people now, they're very nervous about getting involved in China in any way.
Yeah, Sean, can I just add one more thing to this? I think one of the features is not just the bilateral political tensions. I think what we've seen in the last actual couple of decades is a shift in the understanding of what academic research is, what academic ideas are about. I think when most of us, or many of us anyway, started out, the thought was that knowledge is a public good, that academic ideas are non-proprietary, that our mission is to produce original, significant insights that we publish, that we make public, and right now, I think part of what has caused some of the problems in these discussions in American universities is let's just say there's a difference in perspective between, let's say, NYU and NIH, about the nature of what universities are doing. And I think you know, there are some people at NSF who are more like universities. They have a better, what I would consider a better understanding of what science is about. But it's not universally held, and that is making it very, very hard for American universities right now.
Thank you. Jay, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment back that when Jeff said about, you know, right now that everything you read in the news in the US is bad about China and everything in China is bad about the US, is a key point that's important. Throughout the history, right, there have been many more Chinese who have come to America, whether it's for education more recently or for other reasons historically. But if you go through China and you get in a taxi cab, chances are the person in the taxi cab who's driving has a relative who made it big in America, or is doing something in America, or has a young daughter or somebody who's studying in America. That's not true for Americans. And so what I found is when I'm off in the countryside, having dinner in a small restaurant or even just in a village hut, the people were extremely positive about America because everything they knew for their family was a positive thing. Their family had gone there, made wealth, done well, come back and done well. And so even though the headlines are there, sitting over a beer and a bowl of noodles, the view of America is super pro. Whereas nobody in the United States goes to China to make their wealth, or very few of us do. And so as a result, when you go to the heartlands of America and you talk about China, there's lots of misconception. There's nobody who feels that their family heritage is somehow connected to that interaction. And I think ultimately that will mean that as China evolves, the Chinese people will always be more favorable towards the United States, and that will be a good thing for getting back into the communication.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize a common point that three of you have made, which is the chilling effect of the China initiative. The arrest of Professor Chen, Gang Chen, Xi Xiaoxing, and many others has produced this incredible chilling effect, not just on academics who were born in China, but who are now working in the United States, but on academic administrators, on university leadership, and the kind of very productive collaborations that the US has had with China are very difficult to continue. So I really echo that point. So let me summarize some of the questions from that come through the from the audience, and I'm going to summarize them rather than ask each one of you to address what particular question, and feel free to pick and choose the questions that you want to address. One has to do with commenting on the creativity, originality on the part of the Chinese students, which is usually viewed as one area of weakness. And there's another question about the political climate in China, right? And so definitely there's a political climate in this country and between China and the United States, but there's also a political climate in China. Specifically, I think this is a question probably specifically for Jeff, which is that, you know, do your students have unrestricted internet access? There's a question about Westlake University. What do you think about Westlake University, founded by Shi Yigong? And then there's a question on 1,000 Talent program and how good it is, and also some other talent programs. So let me kind of just put these questions out there, and feel free to answer the ones that are of interest to you. Jeff, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Well, let me first start on the one on creativity, because when NYU Shanghai was launched, we were really asked to focus on nurturing creativity in students, as well as in nurturing multicultural effectiveness. We started with a program on creativity and innovation, which is now a minor, and I teach a course on creativity. And I think in terms of the students' creativity and originality, I do think working through the Gaokao system and working through most high schools in China discourage students from challenging the conventional wisdom. They discourage students from doing the thing that is a part of the creative process, which is unlearning, which is saying, how would the world be if this assumption that we all share were tweaked? And so when I think most of us have the experience when students come out of these systems and first arrive in a campus like ours, where they're required to speak, test new ideas, make mistakes, take risks, all of those things, it's quite unsettling. And so the first few weeks are hard. And then after, I don't know, a month or two, the students are off to the races, and they're fantastic. And some of our students who have done the most original work as students are Chinese students, and they're off now to the best PhD programs in the world. And so it's not about natural talent. It's not about. It's just about the incentive systems that they had through high school. But I think, you know, people are still pretty plastic when they're 18 years old, and so it's not hard to unleash that. And in fact, you know, the most famous TED Talk of all time is by Ken Robinson, who talks about how schools in UK beat the creativity out of their students as well. So this is a common issue. In terms of our students' internet access, yes, we are plugged into the entire NYU global network, which means anything that a student in New York or London or Abu Dhabi or any of the places where NYU is, they all see the same world. They all have complete access to the other things. Westlake Shiyigong, I just have to say, I think it's a great example of experimentation and initiative in China, in Chinese higher education. And you know, he's obviously a star, and he has a vision for building a research community that I think is quite admirable.
Great, Juan?
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I used to bring 30 students from China over to Cornell each summer for a month. And half of them, as soon as they got here, adopted the American style. They were creative, wanted to work on what they wanted to do. But half of them would come and ask me, what should I do today? So I think it's still a problem, but at least there are signs that significant numbers of them, when exposed to a really open environment and one where you should do what you're curious about, it's the really top ones. About half of them fell in that category.
So Jay, there's a question specifically for you, coming from Yiran, Professor Yiran Chen. The question is that China now is facing increasing competition from Vietnam in terms of manufacturing, in terms of foreign direct investments. What do you think about Vietnam in terms of its potential to compete with China as the next kind of a supply chain operation for the world?
Right. So, okay. I had a few things I wanted to say about the other topic, but I'll stick to this.
No, but Jay, please also talk about other topics too. Yeah, this is additional to those other topics.
Okay, I'll try to get through those quickly. So at first, I think Westlake and SUSTech are both great experiments, and I think that we should see where those are going to go. I think, but those are great examples. The 1,000 Talent Program, I think, is a great program, and it's a program that would be modeled after programs I've seen in the United States or Germany or elsewhere for recruiting talent. Again, the openness of communication was more the problem than the execution of the program itself. That's what I say. And if somebody wants to follow up, I can give lots and lots of details about this. But again, it's no nefarious thing. But there is a huge cultural difference. What I found is that when the Chinese heard that the United States was worried about 1,000 Talent, many Chinese university presidents' knee-jerk response was, let's remove this from our web pages so as not to expose our faculty to this kind of information or to this kind of investigation. And I went directly to several presidents and said, no, this is exactly the wrong way to deal with the West, because they're going to find out the information anyway. You're not protecting anyone. And there was just a total cultural misconnect, which is then cascaded further. But it's a great program overall. It gives you a boost in salary. It gives you startup funds. It gives you access to students. It's an enviable program for any country.
Jay, can I just on this topic? As far as you know, right, the 1,000 Talent Program has not been used as a spy espionage program, as a program to steal American technology, American knowledge, right? So, because that's the kind of the common perception that in the United States, some politicians have, right? From what you describe, that's not at all true. Is that correct? Yeah.
Right. I think so. I think there we should clarify the fact that the 1,000 Talent Program as an academic program, which is where the U.S. seems to have focused its attention, there's no evidence of any espionage going on in those type of programs, to my knowledge. The issue is that in the early days, there was also an industrial component of the 1,000 Talents. So a startup company could use the 1,000 Talent Program. I forget, Jeff, if you remember the exact name, but there was a special category that could be used by companies. And there, I think the worry might be that, if somebody from DuPont Central Research is recruited to a competing tech company in China, how do they forget what they knew working in, company to company transfer? But that's not where the press has been. The press has been about academics who forgot to file some form, or who, in my view, were stupid in not openly talking about things, but not because they were planning any deep espionage against the United States. So that, to that point, I just want to harmonize with my two colleagues about student creativity. Chinese students are just as creative as anyone else, and the distribution is, they're also not creative, but it is the system telling them don't do it, rather than their inherent creativity. And we saw that even in Tianjin, in the Chinese National University. Once the students came and into our program, learned in English, interacted with Western scholars, they all blossomed because they all realized they had that freedom. So it's really just giving them the opportunity to blossom. But we did have the issue of access. And whereas Jeff has a privileged position, Tianjin University did not. We had to apply for every IP site we wanted to access, right? But anyway, those are to try to go down your list. But Vietnam is a very important issue because Vietnam's economy is super hot. It's growing extremely quickly. The Vietnamese people are very industrious. They want to make this happen. They want that fraction of the supply chain. But their education system is a disaster. It's very political. As you know, to become a professor in Vietnam, you have to apply to a national agency. Vietnamese grants are often taxed with unusual overhead, let's call it that way, that you apply for $1 million NMR, but only 300,000 shows up at your door. So there are lots and lots of complications there. And right now, I think VinUni is trying to do something. Pentecost is trying to do something. The place I was at, Fulbright, says that they want to do something in the liberal area, but nobody's really gotten traction yet. My view is Vin is perhaps one of the better in getting towards that traction because they have the backing of Cornell and Penn. But one university and 100 million people, right? So Vietnam's population is somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 the US. If the US has 200 great universities, when's Vietnam going to have 50? When is Vietnam going to have 10? That's going to be a big concern for them, unless they can recruit back their diaspora with as much success as China has. But they're going to need to have at the MOE level in Vietnam, they're going to have to rethink education and training. And they're going to have to also think about the leaky pipeline, which is that people who come up and are not immediately stars at the age of 18, they may blossom at the age of 30. How do they get back into the system? How do they feed back? Which US, Switzerland, other places do very, very well. China does not do very well in this, by the way, right now.
That's a very interesting comment on Vietnam. I have interacted with Vietnamese government officials, and they cleanly recognize the deficit in the higher education program. I think Ford Foundation is doing something there, but I just don't know how much progress they have made. So another issue is American universities have historically been reluctant to set up degree programs abroad. And NYU is almost an exception that proves the rule. And so if it is okay, let me ask Jeff to explain the kind of the NYU thinking about this issue. Why NYU is so different from other universities in this regard?
Well, I would note that students at Duke Kunshan get Duke degrees as well, but NYU and Duke are unusual. I think it's a little hard to know exactly, but I should say, Cornell, of course, has the Weill Cornell Medical School in Doha. And there are lots of universities that do have targeted programs where one school is offering a degree overseas, often a professional degree. I think NYU and Duke have been unusual in being willing to establish full-blown degree granting campuses, comprehensive research programs overseas. And I think it's honestly, it's a lot of work. It's just a big commitment of planning resources, of faculty time, faculty talent. Faculty would rather be doing their research and teaching, and to be, rather than being working on design of a curriculum in a new place. I think for both NYU and Duke, there was a golden moment where there was a sense of opportunity to reconceptualize the mission of the university as a whole. So NYU Shanghai is not thought of as just an outpost or something like that. It's integrated completely into the philosophy of NYU and the structure of NYU. And I think most universities aren't interested in redefining themselves in that way.
And just to be clear, the curriculum in Shanghai is similar or even the same as curriculum in New York?
It's very similar, but we have NYU Shanghai characteristics. So we it's a liberal education, distributional requirements. So students have to do whatever they're. So the undergraduate program There are majors in natural sciences, humanities, social sciences, business, engineering. But whatever your major is, there are distributional requirements where you have to study in all the different intellectual domains. We started with some original things. NYU in New York had an interactive media arts graduate program. We offered it as an undergraduate major, and then it was adopted as an undergraduate major in New York. We have a program, as I mentioned earlier, our PCI, our program on creativity and innovation, is new and really reflected a strong interest on the part of our Chinese partners. There was a sense that this was a way in which we might be able to facilitate innovation in the world of undergraduate education. NYU sometimes describes what they call a recursive effect, where we can be a kind of a skunkworks for the university. We can try stuff out in Shanghai that might be hard to do in New York because schools get fairly set in their ways. And then if it works out and it looks like it's good, then it can be copied back.
Okay, so we are coming to the close at 9:30. Just last question, maybe very brief from each one of you, and then Xiaodong is going to give some concluding remarks. There's a question about suggestions to the Chinese professors and Chinese academics, how to preserve and maybe even expand international collaboration in the current climate. So maybe I can ask John, Jay, and then Jeff in that order, and then Xiaodong to conclude the session.
Yeah, but see, my view is a little bit different. It's not, I don't believe it's the mission of a university to do research. There is this definition of what we call basic research, and it has nothing to do with how fundamental it is. The definition has to do with why you're doing it. It's because you're curious about something. And I think what's important for Chinese faculty is to really focus on what they're curious about, because they'll be much more successful. And most of them, it's not going to lead to anything. But the fact that NSF was set up to fund basic research in US universities was maybe financially the best investment they ever made. Because if you're doing applied research, you may advance the particular field a little, but you won't find something fundamentally new. But if you're just doing basic research and exploring what you're curious about, most of it's not going to lead to much, but occasionally it'll lead to something really fundamental, which will create whole new industries and millions of jobs. So I would just encourage Chinese faculty to focus on what they really are excited and curious about.
I don't have a great answer to your question, Yasheng. I think it's a really hard question. I think right now, it's much more colleague to colleague. I think it's important that Chinese research colleagues stay in touch with their overseas colleagues and feel comfortable talking freely. I think things get bad if we become so fearful that we stop talking. I think that's my one strongest piece of advice, I guess.
Thank you. Jay?
Yeah, so first let me I disagree with John a little bit. I think universities, and I think you'll agree with me in the end, universities do have as one of their principal missions research, because I believe research is the capstone of a liberal education. The ability to generate new knowledge by asking fundamentally new questions, which is how I define research, is essential to being the proof that your liberal education has some influence on society. So I understand why people would want to do this. I would say, as Jeff has just said, communication is crucially important. And so in these day and age, although we want bottom-up organic interactions between faculty members, I would encourage faculty members at Chinese universities to talk with their deanships or with their university administrators and make that connection. Although the fundamental connection still needs to be researcher to researcher working on these curiosity problems. Which in this climate, it's worth taking the extra step to making sure that everybody understands what's going on and that one is transparent about it. And unfortunately, the reality is that you're just not, it's very, very difficult to get funding in, I think in both environments. I think the US and China, it's very difficult to get funding for the kind of research that Jeff and John and I would all think is the one we would like to see as being emblematic for our universities.
Xiaodong, before I turn to you, let me just say that thank you so much, the three speakers. But I also want to acknowledge that Dennis Simon is in the audience, and he is the advisor to Duke University's collaboration in Kunshan. He's very knowledgeable. You may know him, and he has a lot of knowledge in this area. So maybe in the future, you can, three of you can have a conversation with Dennis about these issues and have an exchange of points of view. He has been making some very good comments in the chat box.
I think we all know Dennis very well.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Xiaodong, the floor is yours to conclude.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Thank you, Jay, John, and Jeff for such a wonderful webinar. And there's lots of insights into the development, progress, and challenges in the rise of Chinese universities. Thank you, Yasheng, for moderate the webinar. I also like to thank Nancy Chin for giving us excellent support. Thank you for all the participants and excellent questions to the webinar. I hope to see you in next month's webinar, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.